Before we get started this week, I just wanted to let you know I spent some time with Jess over at the Flaky Foodie. I was talking about spice, so if you don't want to listen to more of me talking about that, it's also a good place to listen to other interesting topics like Juneteenth and grilled cheese and one of my favorites, Finnish food and sauna culture, where you can learn about the sandwich cake. So go check out Jess on the Flaky Foodie. I'll have links to my appearance with Jess on the Flaky Foodie, along with my other favorite episodes of the show, both the podcast and her YouTube channel, in the show notes. Now here we go. Episode 60, Cider, the drink of liberty. Only Royalists drink beer. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be veering off the grain-fed track I've been on for the last few episodes as we visit cider. For the dedicated 18th century trailblazer in independence and in settling land, beer was right out. Apple cider was the real colonial drink. For a look at the place of 18th century cider in the political and economic circumstances of the time, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the upcoming political rift that will start a whole new country seems to involve disputes involving a wide variety of non-water beverages. We talk of the Boston Tea Party, sure, the Stamp Acts that taxed all sorts of printed paper goods, and the Quartering Acts, which meant, surprise, you have British soldiers as house guests. That's the reason for the Third Amendment to the Constitution, by the way. But the way non-water beverages worked in the 18th century meant that they were especially taxable, in whole or in part. Beer, because some of the ingredients were imported, and there was a fair amount of this tradesman and that tradesman exchanging malt and barrels and hops and so on. Rum was easily taxable, especially with the imported molasses or the finished products in barrels. Wine and brandies and sherries were also entirely imported, so went through known merchants most of the time. Though, don't forget the pirates. These guys engaged in a certain amount of tax-free sales. And then there was the tea and the up-and-comers coffee and chocolate. Again, easily taxable imports. And the bulk of the beer, rum, tea, coffee, and chocolate, along with quite a bit of the brandy, sherry, and even the wine, were consumed in taverns or public houses, which were, for the most part, licensed. So we're paying some sort of taxes or fees to some sort of governing body. But there was one alcoholic, colonial, non-water beverage that regularly and fairly easily skirted the taxman. That was cider. Almost exclusively apple cider. In Europe, there was a decent trade in perry or pear cider, especially in northern France and southern England, but in the colonies, it was all apple, just about all the time. Unlike grape or other fruit wines, apples for cider are a low-maintenance crop. Grape arbors and vineyards are persnickety and get all sad when there's too much water or not enough water or maybe the wrong amount of sun. And then they can get strange rusts and mildew dusts on the fruits, get eaten by birds and rats, and should be picked within a short window, and ideally need to be crushed right away after picking. Apples, on the other hand, are a calmer, a more staid and hearty fruit, and they do you the favor of literally falling at your feet when it's picking time. Not only that, cider can, in fact should, be made from the light scratch and dent apples that are not fit for the barrel in the cellar. Anything too dented with lots of squishy spots or even the worm of legend and pictorial fame, those apples should really get fed to the pigs or the chickens that live in the yard. Fruit that is too rotted makes cider that's not so good. There are limits. Now, if you've joined this podcast in the middle, or it's been a little while, you can go back to episode 28 on 17th century cider for how the process works. Believe me, it hasn't changed in the 100 years since I talked about it last, except possibly in the volume of cider produced. By the 18th century, there was more community cooperation, mainly because there were more communities and some of the presses have gotten quite a bit larger. Last year, I had a chance to visit an offshoot of the Smithsonian Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, the Mercer Museum at Fonthill Castle, this rather crackers early concrete castle. I was there after a large rainstorm, and the leaks they were soaking up in the attic made me feel so many things for the conservators of all the wood and iron and cloth things in that building. Regardless of not being the best building for it, the Mercer Museum has the most impressive, obsessive, and extensive collection of the tools and furnishings of the 18th and early 19th century American daily life I've ever seen. Butter churns, thick glass bottles, wooden spoons, iron fireplace furniture, candy molds, and yes, apple presses. The one I'm including in the show notes was a little hard to photograph because it's about half the size of a stereotypical Little House on the Prairie log cabin. Be sure to look up at the hand-carved screws under the shake roof. This press was the size a community or commercial orchard would use to do large pressings. Stacks of apple pomace, or pulped apples, were formed into what was termed apple cheeses and were spread on mats and placed between boards of the press and squeezed for their juice. This was a bit of a jump forward from the pomace in hand-woven bags, hand-twisted and squeezed into wooden buckets from last century, but not that far off. With more juice in the works, instead of just making sweet and slightly less sweet cider as they did in the 17th century, now some of the collected juice might be boiled to make sweet syrups. Around the day of pressing, some juice was drunk as sweet juice, but for the most part it was allowed to ferment, a little or a lot, and become cider. The tannins in the apples being used for cider would act as something of a preservative and keep the cider from going to vinegar too fast, the same way hops protected beer of similar alcoholic content. Fermenting would take place in homemade stoneware or rough local clay jugs and jars, as it mainly had in the last century, but with increased trade, more and more fermenting was taking place in the more widely available barrels. All of these steps could take place on the farmstead of an individual, usually a multi-generational family, and not need labor or financial support for processing beyond, possibly, the community press. Unlike with other non-water beverages like tea, beer, wine, or fortified and distilled beverages, none of the materials came from outside what was already available in the farmyard, except possibly a barrel. Because cider was produced with so little interaction with the outside world, it made cider incredibly hard to tax. It also gave cider a few types of reputation. We covered the fact that, particularly in the larger towns of the northern colonies, the ports throughout, and on the larger plantations in the southern colonies, cider was considered more of a rustic drink for the country bumpkins without money or organization to make or purchase proper grain-based beers. In the histories of the Dutch farms in the 17th century, it was common to keep proper beer for the family and invited guests, but to have a barrel of cider by the kitchen door to share with the Native Americans who still had travel and residency rights on the land Dutch families had purchased and set up farms on. It's worth taking a short side trip here to point out that while the 17th century British colonies tended to develop contentious relationships with the locals that often developed into armed conflict because they regarded claimed or purchased land entirely theirs, the Dutch colonists tended to have more amicable relationships with the original residents of the land, since tribes were still able to include Dutch farm, orchard, and forest land in their nomadic rotations of hunting, fishing, and foraging for seasonal game and vegetation. Many an English land buyer in the brand new New York colony was flummoxed to find that deeds purchased from Dutch families would include conditions that allowed members of a local tribe or family band continued transitory occupancy rights on a parcel of land. So when seasonal residency for hunting or foraging began, visits and exchanges of gifts were customary. Often, Dutch farmers budgeted these obligations of hospitality in, for it saved a lot of trouble over the long run. Practically, including conditions for continued seasonal transit and occupations by indigenous occupants of the property usually meant that the tiny Dutch military presence wasn't required to defend or recover Dutch settlers from armed conflicts with the locals. English settlers, on the other hand, often decided that because native land use of any one spot was not permanent, rather it rotated through years or was seasonal, the English sort of viewed it as a no backsies, once the previous local inhabitants had granted or given up ownership to an English landowner. So once an English landowner claimed land after a Dutch landowner, much of the fairly amicable visiting and trading was done away with, and this set up a very different dynamic with the Native Americans. The story of British colonial settlement often includes stories of colonists and soon Americans who at one time had amicable or at least stable interactions with Native Americans at older settlements back east. But as they moved south into North Carolina from Virginia or up from South Carolina, or moved through that meteor-made hole in the Appalachians, the Cumberland Gap, into Kentucky, violent conflicts could arise. For the colonists were crossing over lines initially laid down under seals and treaties obliging King George III's government to maintain them. But with King George so far away and then removed from the head of the local governmental structures, all the treaties, poof, were gone. So stories abound like those of Daniel Boone and his family, who were flabbergasted that old stable relationships with Native Americans would become acrimonious as they moved into areas previously marked as out of bounds for the English. Why, the Boones and many other families would ask, are you so mad at us coming in here and setting up a house and a farm and hunting on this land when you're mostly not here most of the time? From further away in space and time, and through the lens of growing and hunting food, it seems positively ludicrous that colonists, who would soon see themselves as pioneers, would feel so shocked by the idea that the people who had been using this land as their larder and living space would want these interlopers off their land. But the feeling among the British colonists, and soon the Americans, ever with an eye to the values of back home, even after they left the Dominion, was that these Indians, these savages, were not using the land in the best way, not in a civilized way. There were no permanent buildings, there were no fences, and there were no cows. The savage, apparently temporary use and occupation of the land was just squatting, not ownership, and as a result, needed to be neither respected or even tolerated. One way the British colonists began to define their permanent occupation of the land they were claiming was through the planting of apple trees and the cultivation of orchards. An established orchard of apple trees, along with some other fruit, became a way for the encroaching colonists to claim land as civilized, a sort of signal that it's too late to claim this land. You can't have it back. Next century, we'll get a peek in on Europeans moving onto tribal lands and justifying it by pointing out the establishment of apple orchards by Native women. More than one farmer finding an already established and apparently abandoned orchard would assume that the land was up for civilization by Europeans because the orchard was there. But that's later and further afield in the Ohio and Missouri River basins. In the colonial 18th century, as settlement was almost entirely on the east side of the Appalachians from Maine, then considered Upper Massachusetts, down to South Carolina, but not Florida. Florida was still La Florida and firmly Spanish at this point. The apple tree was generally a sign of land claimed and settled, which is also, as a frontier-pushing tree, where cider got some of its reputation as the drink of the frontier leather-stocking ruffians, the rustic small farmer, and the unlettered woodland rubes. But that wasn't its only reputation. As the 18th century rolled along in the colonies, multiple campaigns of different intensity arose, protesting certain policies created and upheld by either home British rule or colonial British governors. We've covered the annoyance with the different navigation acts and the duties placed on imported materials, hops and molasses especially, when it came to brewing beer and distilling rum. While there was the home-grown is best campaigns around beer, not to mention, with those duties on molasses, they're practically making us smuggle molasses in from the French and Dutch islands, justifications. The campaign for all American cider beyond the reach of the king was strong. But there was a second reason cider became a virtuous drink, especially in the northerly New England and some of the mid-Atlantic colonies. There was a recognition that sugar and its byproduct molasses depended on the importation of thousands of captive Africans to work brutal jobs for the last years of their cruelly truncated lives. pamphlets and speeches were regularly held in the halls of Quakers and other religious denominations dedicated to the saving of all souls, not just those of the white races. All Earth's children were God's children in many a meeting hall. For these people, the most obvious products of the labor of captive slaves was eschewed. Sugar was replaced with maple molasses or syrup and maple sugar and local honey, and rum and the shortcut molasses beer were replaced with wholesome local cider. Divisions regarding human labor were present from the start of this country and created divisions even before the country was stitched together. So many an idealist would drink no molasses-based drink. Then as now, the lines of what supported the outlines of slavery could get murky. So providing food in the form of salt fish or working at a shipyard that built and serviced slaver ships might be part of a rum abstainer's livelihood. And just to entangle and complicate things further, there were many ways that apple-based alcohol was part of the plantation economy that helped large landowners extract more profits from the surrounding countryside. While there was a growing commerce in grain and beer in the Mid-Atlantic and New England colonies that helped establish and grow the network of roads, grain and beer traveled mainly along the waterways in southern colonies. So the southern small-holding farmers who had land that was only accessible by roads tended to be southern cider and fruit wine drinkers. But in the summer and fall, when temperatures were higher, these drinks only had short shelf lives. The late summer bounty of fruit, unless pickled, much of it would not make it through the steamy, insect-ridden months until winter, unless it were distilled. Much of the cider and fruit wines that most people made only had a desirable existence of weeks or maybe a few months until it went to vinegar in the warmer coastal areas of the southern colonies. I mean, why do you think so many people moved inland and built houses in the Appalachians, the Blue Ridge, and the Smoky Ranges? It was so much less swampy and hot most of the year. But back to distilling. These large plantation owners that were building their own mini mercantilist empires added distilling apple cider into apple brandy into their ways of making money. To distill brandy for drinking and distribution required a large-ish still and an adequate supply of wood. And to get these, a significant capital outlay was required, or impressive proof of collateral. Credit terms in those days were much less generous and typically were only granted to men of means, be it in lands, a noble title, or a collection of ships, trading, or pirate, depending on the circumstances. The same plantation owners who produced all their own meat, flour, beer, vinegar, and even nails also sought to limit their purchases of distilled alcohol. Some aged French brandy or jolly Spanish sherry might be imported and paid for with silver coin, but most of the distilled alcohol to be consumed for less propitious and special occasions, the heads of the household and the keepers of the books preferred to go housemaid for the booze as well as the beer. Records of still purchases and repairs are regular features in the account books of many a plantation, including mentions in well-preserved documents from the estates of people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the William Byrdses, and Henry Lawrence. This introduction of distilled liquor in larger quantities into the economy of the southern colonies due to simple temperature considerations, beer and cider just didn't last, also explains partly why the South would develop a punch and cocktail culture while the Mid-Atlantic and New England colonies would become beer cultures. As we go into the 19th and even 20th centuries, cider and fruit wines would hang on longer in the South than they did in the North because, let's face it, there was simply so much fruit, so why not make cider and fruit wine? It was simple, it cost no money, just labor, and it was good while it lasted. Beer was so much more work, and frankly, compared to simply made wine, just wasn't as good unless you bought hops, and then if you're buying stuff, why even bother? At least when purchasing the apple and fruit brandies from the large plantations, and later the whiskeys that are about to happen, these things would last and could be used both for hospitality and medicinally. Now, most of the distilled product was neither fine nor, on its own, delicious. Quite a bit was rough and raw. Aging liquors to make them smooth over the time period of years was just about to happen. It was only in its accidental babyhood in the 18th century colonies. Besides these southern apple brandies, there was one more apple tipple of the colonial era, and we even have a version of it that floats around American liquor stores today. But I promise you, it is no longer made the way it used to be, and that is definitely a good thing. That beverage was Applejack. Up north, where beer did keep in cellars that got cold and a good part of the winter was literally freezing cold, there was a way to crudely distill the cider that made it into the winter months. Now, I get to bust out chemistry again. Well, physical chemistry anyway. If you remember from the distillation side trails we took, water boils at a higher temperature than ethanol, as well as some other not-so-nice ethanol-adjacent alcohols and other chemicals. Well, while water boils at a higher temperature, it also freezes at a higher temperature than ethanol. And just as mixtures of water and ethanol boil at lower temperatures than plain water, they also freeze at lower temperatures than plain water. Well, to be fair, just about all water-based mixtures freeze at lower temperatures than plain water. That's why we salt roads to prevent ice and so on. But for those of you who are of an alcohol drinking persuasion, you have probably at some time or another placed a bottle of vodka or other distilled alcohol in your freezer to keep it extra cold. And while there are solid ice cubes in the freezer, the liquor remains a liquid, though it may have a bit of a thicker, syrupy texture. Now, this has to do with the fact that water is entirely polar. It's trying to magnet the positive ends to the negative ends of the other water molecules. And so you get things like surface tension, where you can float paper clips or insects on it, and it allows cool frost crystals to form on your windows. But unlike water that is all polar, alcohol has one polar end and one non-polar end. That's why rubbing alcohol will dissolve greasy stains and types of markers that water can't. Oh, and do not drink rubbing alcohol. That's isopropanol and it will poison you. I mean, high-proof ethanol will also dissolve grease and permanent marker, but it's more expensive for lots of reasons, and so is silly to waste on cleaning tasks. But that amphitrophic nature, the fact that it's part polar and part nonpolar, means that plain ethanol or ethanol and water mixtures need even colder temperatures to become solids than just plain water. In mixtures that are mostly water, like home fermented cider, what will happen first is that pure crystals of water will form. In the jacking process, these crystals were removed and a more concentrated solution of alcohol and water would be left behind. Using this trick, leaving cider in barrels out in the freezing cold, a crude sort of distillation through freezing, it would produce a drink called Applejack. It was rough and often gave the drinker terrible hangovers. For along with the ethanol, the stuff that would be separated out in regular heat distillation was being concentrated along with the ethanol in this crude freeze distillation method. The resulting Applejack was a strong drink compared to the original cider it started as, and was consumed as a warming drink during the long New England winters. The distillation process using only the freezing method didn't persist for long because of the terrible hangovers and sometimes some not-so-great flavors. As soon as stills became more widespread, the freeze distillation step would just be the first step and then be followed by a heat distillation step to make a nicer, more genteel Applejack. And the modern product you can find at your local liquor store, it's all heat distilled and won't rough you up like the historical beverage. But if it's American made of American apples, go ahead and call it Applejack rather than Apple Brandy. But overall, the Apple Brandy of the southern colonies was an additional revenue source for the plantations, but the Applejack of the northern colonies was treated more like cider, mostly a homemade and home-consumed product. Later on, Applejack would get some community distribution, especially as the heat distillation second step was added. So apple cider and the related apple brandy and Applejack besides being ways to evade the tax man and sometimes to make a little extra money, came to have ethical and revolutionary sentiments hooked to it. It was clear that imported brandy and wine and sherry were all for the rich man, but beer was more a drink of the regular guy. But because it often used imported ingredients, it was considered a drink of the Royalists. Due to its homegrown reputation, sure, cider might be for the frontier farmer and the poor country bumpkin, but it was the most patriotic because it only required the work of a free man. So was seen by those carrying around that banner as the most patriotic tipple of all. So as the political beverage lines were being drawn throughout the 18th century, cider came out on top. Next week, it's back to grain, but a new one this time, rice. Associated with fanciness in Europe, the southern colonies, South Carolina especially, will cash in on this prestige crop. The way rice was used and cooked in the 18th century will look strange if you only go back to American cookbooks of the 1990s and later. But earlier than that, or if you look at the rice cooking styles of Southern Europe and North and West Africa, even today, you'll see what was going on. So join me next time for boiled rice and Carolina Gold. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with any promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Questions or quibbles will reach me via email at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com or on Twitter, where I am most active. If you could leave a review for this podcast on your favorite podcast player, it helps make me more visible to the history and food curious people out there. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOAFood and the same place on Instagram and in the show description.